Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest teaching session in the course on technology and the future of medicine. Today, we're talking about whales, robots, and you, how technology may change what you think of as a person. And it's not me giving the main lecture, but Heather Graves. I just wanted to tell you something, I think you'll find it a little bit amusing, about my own relationship to things in this area. That has to do with the course and my plans to get a pair of octopus. I was going to get 2 octopuses and come and tell the class how it was going with, the octopuses. This was my plan. Why haven't I done it yet? Well, I think the octopuses would outsmart me at the moment. I need to get a little bit better in terms of preparing for them coming into my life. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the reasons that I think that. So the remarkable story, cephalopods, octopus, cuttlefish, and squid. They're remarkably beautiful, and they can do many things with their bodies that you can't at all do with yours. They have no bones, and so the hardest thing in their body is the eye. And they can squinch the rest of their body up to go through incredible small spaces and cracks as long as the eye will fit through. So you can imagine how tiny, and they're very, very clever. Now, a lot of the writing, we're going to talk today about writing, a lot of the writing about the octopus asks what I think is a kind of a stupid question. Why are they so smart? Why do they need to be smart? They only live 1 to 5 years. They don't do anything all that exciting. Why are they as intelligent as they are? Well, I think it's enjoyable to have, a rich intellectual life. All of you feel that. So even if you don't have that much to do with your, intellect, it's still fun. And they also do engage in play. They do things that are very much like play and having fun and having toys and all this kind of thing. So I'm not sure it's such a valid question of how they got to be so smart or whether they are smarter than they need to be. They exhibit personality. There's considerable diversity amongst them. So there are 13 of you in the room at the moment. If there were 13 octopuses, and if they were presented with some sort of challenge or stimuli, their reaction would be as varied as the 13 of you would be to something. So they indeed have personalities, different ways of coping with things. They can engage in amazing color and shape changes. They can fit into the background, even a very heterogeneous visual background. They can create a pattern on their bodies that fits in so you can't see them against that heterogeneous background. They can engage in problem solving, and one of their big problems is getting stuff to eat, right? So if they're in the tank, let us call this the octopus tank, and there are other tanks around with other kinds of fish, during the night, they will find a way to get out of their tank, go into the other tanks, eat the fish in the other tanks, and then they know that they're supposed to be in their tank, so they go back to their tank. And in the morning they say, "What, me? I have no idea where those fish went." Ha! Prove that I had something to do with the absence of the fish that used to be in those other tanks. So, even if their tentacles or arms are severed from the body, there's still considerable intellect in each of the tentacles. So a severed tentacle can still grasp things, can move something useful like a piece of food to where the mouth would be, if indeed that was still a part of the octopus. So I think the way to look at it is your intelligence is much more centralized in your head. They have 3 hearts, and they have like little parts of their brain all over the body. And it's just a different way to kind of, approach the challenges of life. So who's smarter, us or them? Well, I can only tell you I haven't dared to purchase them yet because I think probably make a a chaotic mess of my life. So at the moment, I think they're a little bit smarter than I am, and when I think I'm up to the challenge, then I'll buy some and tell you what it's like having them as pets. So really, that's all I had to say today, and so we'll now switch over to...
Hello, nice to meet you all. I'm Heather Graves. I'm a professor in the Department of English and Film Studies, but I do not teach the analysis of literature. I teach writing and rhetoric. So I don't do a lot of standing up in front of people and talking. I do a lot of talking very briefly and then giving people writing assignments to practice in class. So lecturing is not my strong suit, but I'll do the best I can here to talk about interesting things today. I'm going to talk about, raise some questions, I guess, about whales, robots, and you, how technology may change what you think of as a person. Then the latest science is also telling us that cetaceans or whales also qualify as humans or persons, which is a really interesting idea. So this is a summary of some of the latest research about whales. So apparently whales have distinct cultures. Every clan is unique, so they have different feeding and migration patterns. They have different child care preferences. Their rates of reproduction differ from whale pod to whale pod. Each clan also speaks its own dialect, and that's one way that they identify who's part of the clan and who isn't. The dialects are learned. They're not genetic, and they also persist through time, so they're handed down from one generation to the next. And the whales that grow up in a particular clan can speak to each other, and they can recognize other whales that are not relatives of theirs. Hal Whitehead is a biologist at Dalhousie University who studies whales from a boat rather than tracking them through technology. He says that if humans break up a group of whales, they're destroying an ancient living culture. So there's a lot of elements there that qualify in the definition of humanity. Apparently, whale brains are also really highly developed, so they're really different from other mammals' brains, especially land mammals. This is a picture, it's a cartoon picture, but what it's trying to represent is not only the difference in size, but apparently the number of convolutions in the brain are directly related to intelligence. And what they found is that the whale brain is even more convoluted than the human brain, which means that whales are in some ways smarter, but it's a different kind of intelligence than humans have. So that Marino says that whales are an alternative evolutionary route to complex intelligence. They have a really well-developed limbic system, which is the part of your brain that processes emotions. They have actually a paralimbic lobe that is an add-on really to the limbic lobe that actually protrudes into the cortex of the brain. So, which means that their ability to process emotions is extraordinary, I suppose. So what this suggests, though, is that whales combine emotional and cognitive thinking, which has led to sophisticated social communication and self-awareness. So they communicate, they use their brains in ways that are different than humans. And whale scientists are concluding that whales are more socially connected, more communicative, and coordinated than humans. So they actually exceed us in intelligence in some ways. This is another really interesting aspect. They use echolocation not just to locate food, they also use it as a way of communicating. And Hal Whitehead says this is the world's most powerful imaging device. And he suggests that they use it as an ultrasound to see inside each other's bodies. So they can see what each other's eaten, they can see who's sick, they can see who's pregnant. So they've got a knowledge of each other that far exceeds what's possible for humans. So people working on this problem, they think that whales process this information and they can share it with each other. So they actually are communicating in ways that we can't really even imagine, I guess. So a widely dispersed whale, so as they're swimming around the ocean, they can form a single sensory loop in which they share information. So, and this research led to 2 years ago an academic conference where the scientists, philosophers, a whole bunch of interdisciplinary groups came together to look at the latest whale science and talk about the possible, is there a necessity for whales to have rights? So their position is stated here. This is from their website. In spite of some forms of conservation measures, cetaceans are currently treated as resources to be harvested, and yet many elements point in a different direction. So international law manifests a growing sense of duty to whales and dolphins. Contemporary ethical reflection brings new theoretical tools to bear on cetacean moral status, and scientific research gives us novel insights into the complexities of cetacean minds and societies. In light of this, scholars from the relevant disciplines drew together to spell out all the implications of such developments and to build a collective case for the attribution of basic moral and legal rights to cetaceans, great and small. So this was held in Helsinki, Finland, a couple years ago. And at the end of the conference, they put together a declaration of the rights for cetaceans, which is listed here, the bullet points, and it's quite interesting. So whales have the right to life. They shouldn't be held in captivity or servitude. They shouldn't be subject to cruel treatment or removed from their natural environment. They have the right to freedom of movement and residence within their natural environment. So they're not the property of any state, corporation, human group, or individual. They have the right that their environment be protected, and so on. So that's kind of intriguing and arresting. So the next step, though, is that's just a declaration. It's not binding on anything. It's really interesting to see scientific people come together and take a stand like that. But this project has now morphed into the Nonhuman Rights Project, which they have a website called the Nonhuman Rights Project if you want more information. And these are some passages that I copied from their website where they kind of outline what their goal is and what they're working towards. So they're putting the issue in legal terms, as you were talking about, with currently animals are legal things, they're not persons. So they possess no legal rights, and they don't have any hope of having them because they're invisible to judges, as long as they remain legally things. So the Nonhuman Rights Project argues that some non-human animals should have the capacity to possess common law rights. And what they're doing now is working towards changing the situation. They cite the great case in 1772 of James Somerset versus Charles Stuart. Somerset sued Charles Stuart, claiming that he was not a possession, he was a human and he had rights. And so that basically overturned, in British law, the ability to keep human slaves. And from there, a lot of the rest of the Western world abolished slavery eventually, too. It took a little longer in the US because it was economically feasible or economically desirable there. In other places like Canada, where it wasn't as economically useful, slavery was abolished a little faster. But there's a precedent there for changing the way that people understand, I guess, things versus persons. So the Nonhuman Rights Project, they have a legal working group, and they've identified 5 states in the US that may be receptive to the kinds of legal arguments that they want to make. They're currently, in the next month, I think they're going to identify a single state where they think they have the best chance, and then they're going to launch a lawsuit on behalf of some animals to challenge the status of some animals as things. So they're actually, they're suggesting that chimpanzees, whales, elephants, and actually gray parrots should have non-human rights. They should be judged to be not things, but legal persons, because it's only legal persons that are entitled to have rights such as bodily integrity and bodily freedom. So that brings us to some good questions, I think. So what are the implications of the Nonhuman Rights Project? And say they do get a court decision that grants a group of animals non-human rights. How will that What potential does that have for altering our current reality?
Well, one thing, not exactly an implication of the Non-Human Rights Project, but more an implication on it is, I wonder if what studies we've done with these animals to really, maybe functional imaging studies of their brain or anything during tasks or something. What studies can we compare to measurements we have of our own sentience, of our own intelligence, so that we can actually compare and see? Because do we really understand what it is, what brain processes it is that make us who we are, deserving of rights and whatnot? And do they cross over there? So that was one thing that came to my mind, is whether or not really they, even if they seem to, what links do we have with them?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, because we don't understand ourselves all that well, do we, really?
On that point, though, just because we're one level or one type of intelligence, it doesn't mean that they don't exhibit a completely different intelligence that we don't understand. That's it.
Yeah, that's true.
So the often stated argument here is one of priorities, I guess, of investigation. Many of these points are obviously valid, but given all the problems that exist in the world right now, do they rise to the top? Is the plight of whales above the human problems of Somalia, Rwanda? Where do you want to? And is that a stupid argument, or is that the right argument? I don't know. It's always the same sort of simplistic thing. People compare the spending on the small amount of spending on beneficial things with the spending on the military and so on. It becomes a kind of knee-jerk reaction. But how do we figure this out? What do the students feel? How important is this in your life? Would you be willing to spend quite a lot of time to improve the rights of whales, or is the priority of that for you really, really low?
I think it's just a question of resources. If someone can deem that there's enough resources in order to properly counter out the problems that are facing people in the developed world who are being affected at the moment, then I don't see why there shouldn't be resources allocated elsewhere, especially if people are willing to use those resources themselves and develop those resources.
You may have noticed this was the first day that I didn't bring the books. There are these 4 books that I keep offering to loan you guys. I didn't bring them today, but the book Existence, David Brin's book that Michael Woodside talked about, and he has recently read, and I have recently read. In there's the phenomenon of uploading, upscaling animal intellect, bringing them up to a human level. And how would we even decide whether they want this, or how would they know whether they want it? It's like taking a retarded child and finding suddenly that there's the opportunity to give them normal intellect. So do you ask the child? How do you, and what would the priority for that be? If you think the quality of life is better, if you have greater intellect, then should we be increasing the intellect of dogs, cats? Where does it end? I think that's an even harder thing to figure out. So any student thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, I definitely agree with the points. Before we start giving rights, we have to decide on rights and on what intellectual abilities, say my cat, Cork, has. She's awful, by the way, but my cat has. It's more important, I think, at this point, rather than deciding how to give the rights or let's put effort into giving the rights. I feel it would be more important and more relevant to actually find what rights should be given, or at what level of intellect someone or some animal needs to be in order to fully experience or appreciate these rights, as opposed to let's all go right on ahead and get rights ready, as opposed to find out what rights are deserved at first.
I just have a bit of a side thought, I guess. While we're looking at different examples of so-called humanity in other organisms, is that kind of related to our tendency to, say, personify things like our own pets? And is that just another case of us seeing what we're looking for, basically? Or is it we're learning something else?
Well, I don't know. They're not really advocating human or like persons' rights for pets. They're really talking about, I think, for example, whales are, I think they're an alien life form that we just don't understand and we just have no idea about. And the more information we get about understanding just how sophisticated their level of life is, and there's not that huge a gulf, I think. So I think they're looking more at things like chimpanzees, that people think it's okay to do testing on them but not on humans, right? When it looks as if they're very similar to humans and they have a sophisticated understanding of a lot of things that we haven't been aware of in the past. So I think that the impetus here really is just to try to get outside of our own or speciesist, I guess, that where we think that we're the pinnacle and that everything else is lesser than we are. So I think it's more trying to get people to recognize that than to, and I don't think they're looking at identical rights to what we have, but something to measure it with. If we understand these groups, then, what is it that we should be doing or not doing? Like maybe we should just leave them all alone, right? Instead of putting them in SeaWorld or having them in circuses and things like that. So I think it's more that's the issue rather than that, we should all spend a lot of money, setting up a nice environment for whales or something like that. It's like, let's just stop killing them and maybe, that's not a bad place to start.
On that topic, I always wonder, the payoffs of it. Say if by experimenting medicine on chimpanzees or something, if through X amount of tests we're allowed to save even just one human life, I wonder what balance we would find where, this benefit to humanity is worth this amount of harm done to these other species, and especially as you're saying, it's a lot different for chimpanzees or whales as opposed to our household pets because they're different levels of intellect. But I always wonder what kind of middle ground everyone has on where the line is and for what amount of benefit should we be willing to pay what amount of price.
Yeah, and that's a really good issue to raise. I was looking at some of the commentary around this whole discussion because it was new to me. I haven't really encountered it before. There's a lot of bandying back and forth of addressing that question. And one of the things that several people points they made was that, in fact, animal testing doesn't really tell us all that much about human beings because they're so different. So we can test on animals and it looks like it doesn't kill that animal, but then you give it to humans and it does kill them. So the argument of the animal rights and the activists is that we're fooling ourselves if we think that is saving human lives because it's not it's not commensurate, I guess. But I don't know, I haven't looked at the science behind this, so that's just, was my looking at the emoting on the internet, right, in people's comments, but it would be worth looking at to see, okay, what are the statistics, what's the facts behind these statements. But yeah, that's an important issue.
All of this, of course, has important implications for robots when we get to machines that are as smart as we are. But we will have created those machines. So in that respect, it's different, you know? It's not that they independently evolved. We created them, and then at some point they became able to create and self-improve themselves and so on. But that will be a big difference. And there are many other differences. You know, with animals, no such thing as turning them off or unplugging them, whereas that's going to be the whole power thing. You can imagine that's something we accept now today. You know, many technology advances have come that are amazing and wonderful, but, you know, batteries really haven't kept up. So the whole power thing is pretty primitive at the moment. And you can imagine that might change in a way that if you were a sentient robot, suddenly you wouldn't have to worry about power. Power is just everywhere. Power is in the air. Power is like breathing, you know. And you wouldn't have to worry about being unplugged. But there still are issues of, you know, what part of your hardware is really you? If you are a robot and you have an identity, if somebody switches out your head, your arm, your this, you know, what is it that makes you you? We have an idea for human beings what makes us who we are. But that may stop mattering when the agenda of the world is being controlled by machines much smarter than we are. Maybe every important idea in the world may have begun with a human being that had a particular name, but by the time it's enhanced and magnified by all the other machine intellects, it may not really matter which human being or what the name of that human being was. So the whole identity thing could change.
I just wanted to make one comment on the animal research thing. I think on an organic level, there are some similarities, and unfortunately not unfortunately, but very fortunate for us in cardiology, for example, within the last 20 or 30 years, there's been some very large technological advancements in treating heart disease that wouldn't have happened without animal studies, because that's actually how our system is designed. And for example, in the US, coronary stenting was not allowed in humans until 10 dogs had successfully survived the stenting process, and that happened a lot quicker in the north actually than in the south. So the north developed their stenting technology a lot quicker than the south did, I think those limitations in our system are part of why it occurs, because we don't have any choice at the moment, and unless these changes are made in the methodology of how we perform our experiments, how we move on to human experiments, and whether a better model is created, then we're always going to be under the limitations of that.
Yeah, that's true. Good point.
So I was just wondering about when you were making the argument about whales, to just stop killing them, and maybe that's a good starting place. And looking at the list, I know there's also been a lot of research done with pigs and how they have a very complex social structure as well, and you can measure stress levels and things like that in pigs as well. And so I think it's really encouraging that chimps are on the list, because that's something where human progress and like things that we need to have in our lives have first been tested on chimps, and if we're going to stop doing that, then maybe we're sacrificing some of these things. But in terms of the implications for agriculture business and things like that, like I think it's maybe telling that pigs aren't on that list yet. But just in terms of like future implications, maybe it'll go more that way. And I don't know if all of you tonight are just going to run out and have like a bacon sandwich after this. Maybe you're all vegetarians already. But yeah, maybe that's another way that this will go in the future.
Yeah.
So we're out of time. Thank you very much for a fascinating teaching session.
You're welcome. Thank you.